Can't get enough of Team Pete? Well, you've come to the right place, as each week I interview supporters of Pete Buttigieg, former candidate for President of the United States and current Secretary of Transportation. Hear their personal stories about why they became part of Team Pete and how they started a movement. Join us as we talk Pete, politics, and anything in between. Hi, everyone. My name is Kim Ang, and I'm the host of this podcast, Talking with Team Pete. And today, my guest is Josh Mandell. Hi, Josh. How's it
Hi,
going?
Kim. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Doing fine, doing fine.
Good. So, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with Team Pete?
Sure. So I was living in South Bend at the time. I moved there with my family in 2000. And so around 2015, I started doing a lot of volunteer work in town, meeting various people. And so, when Pete was running for mayor, met him at a bunch of campaign events, saw him around town. And then once he was elected mayor, we'd see him around at all of the events. There was a group called the Gorilla Gay Bar, and they had a casino night. So I just remember throwing dice with Pete and Chasten in the basement of the Studebaker mansion, which is always a funny thing. And so when he started getting some more national attention, I actually started up a specific Pete Buttigieg subreddit. I'd been running the South Bend subreddit for probably 4 years at about that time. So I started up a Pete subreddit just to kind of cover him, and that was even before he announced his run for president. And then obviously when he announced his run, me and all of my friends, we just started to grow the South Bend Pete supporters organically. So I hosted the first Pete meetup for local supporters. This was before his campaign even got going. And so as he started to increase his campaign size and take more people on, I worked for the digital team. I ran a bunch of Twitter accounts. I ran the subreddit, and then, I volunteered for the campaign. So I was making phone calls, doing everything I could.
Oh, wow. That's quite a lot.
Oh, yeah, we haven't even gotten to the part where I went to Iowa for the caucuses.
So, what's it like having Pete as your mayor?
Uh, South Bend, northern Indiana, definitely a lot of struggle because for those who don't know, the population in South Bend shrunk significantly. Its high was, I think, 165,000 people in 1950 when Studebaker was building cars and things for the war effort. And then in 2020, I think the census had it about 100,000 people. So it was, a pretty significant population loss. And so it was a big deal when that loss stopped at about 100,000 and started going up the other way. I remember the newspapers did a big article about, the South Bend population has gone up 100 people just because the decline finally stopped. And that was probably, again, only in the mid 2010s, maybe. So there's a lot of poverty, a lot of jobs left, a lot of, people struggling. And so Pete inherited a little bit of a mess. And so he did a lot of things he could to improve the city, but there's only so much you can do. We are like politicians and not dictators, so he couldn't just wave his hand and fix a lot of issues, but he made a lot of changes that were very helpful for people. Some of the streets were, we had these big streets that were 4 lanes wide. They're all going in one direction, bifurcating downtown, which made it very difficult to be walkable. So he changed some of the street directions around. He added parks. He did what he could to help improve the city. One of the things that he got a lot of publicity for after he announced his campaign was 100 home in 100 days, because South Bend was devastated by the 2008 financial crisis. A lot of people that were low income all of a sudden are getting offered home loans. So they're moving into these big houses. And then everybody knows, we all got foreclosed on. All of the copper was ripped out of these houses, and they were just sitting there abandoned. So you have a house that's worth $10,000, it needs $30,000 worth of work, but because 4 other houses on that block are also abandoned, the house isn't going to be worth anything after you put all the money in. And so that
Mhm.
was part of the program, was to bulldoze these abandoned houses just to take them off the market and clean up some of the neighborhoods. And so where I was living in the near Northwest, like I just come home one day and I was like, what? I had a neighbor across the street 2 weeks ago. Now I have an empty lot.
Mhm.
Well, not a neighborhood house. There's nobody living in these houses. So that was definitely one of the more visible things that he did, improving the city.
Yeah, and I remember reading an article about how South Bend was one of the dying cities in America. And
Yeah, Newsweek named us like one of the 10 dying cities. And we gotta, it hurts the civic pride a little bit. It's like, we're trying here.
sure, yeah. And so I take it that you run into Pete often, like on the streets or in
Yeah,
local pubs or.
yeah. When I was living in South Bend, we'd see Pete on a regular basis because, even though it's a city of 100,000 people, I guess you would say the socially active community was very small. Like, I don't live in South Bend anymore. I moved to Texas, and it was just kind of funny. Like, no matter where I went, I knew everybody. I'd go to like the Oyster Bar, and Dominic's behind the bar. I'm like, oh, Dominic, I remember your mother, and I know everybody who works there. And three friends of mine are sitting at the bar. Like, it's a very tight city. So
Mhm.
anytime there was any big event, like there were concerts, the local NPR station would have events. One of the pictures I sent you was from seeing Pete at the Riverlights Music Festival. I was a volunteer for them for I think 4 or 5 years. They were a 2-day music festival in South Bend that focused on original music only. And so, Pete got up and played the piano. One of
Mhm.
the things is Ben Folds came out for the South Bend 150 celebration, and Pete got up on stage and played the piano with him and the South Bend Symphony Orchestra. That was definitely something to see. So yeah, he was definitely very visible, very out in the community. You could always talk to him. After Pete announced his campaign, he didn't have any local campaign office yet in South Bend. They were working, they had a private campaign office, but we had a lot of people coming through town. Hey, I'm visiting South Bend, how do I do some Pete stuff? And so me and some of the other local people are like, well, we can go, you know, get some lunch or something and I can show you around South Bend, but there wasn't anything Pete specific that people could visit. Because again, he didn't have an existing campaign. Like if somebody's a senator, they've run for 3 or 4 things, like President Obama, he was a senator in Illinois. So when he announced his candidacy, he already had campaign advisors and material and all of these things. He didn't have any of that. He had like 5 people when he started. I had more people running the subreddit than he had campaign staff at the beginning. And so, there was a big demand. So finally, Pete opened up the campaign office in South Bend. And so that was kind of a big thing. So we started having events there. The opening was great. Pete had a large amount of religious leaders come out, and it was a big celebration for the community. So we had the office open, started selling merch, started having people coming in. So a lot of the volunteers would staff that during the day. So that was a pretty big deal. And then that's when we started phone banking into Iowa. That's kind of where we would meet. Everybody would get together. We do the software. For people who don't know, you generally only call landlines. And so that's why polling, especially for primaries, is kind of, I'm not going to say fungible, but the results that you get from those polls aren't the best because you're looking for people that have a landline phone in the year 2020, in the year 2019. So the demographic was definitely, shall we say, the boomer or older generation. So that
Mhm.
made it very difficult. But, we made, I don't know how many phone calls I made. I probably made 1,000 phone calls. We had guys in the office making, multiple thousand phone calls because it's just number after number after number. And I'm like, yeah, I live in South Bend. I know Pete. Let me tell you about him. It was just funny because I remember I got somebody from Cory Booker's campaign. I was like, well, see you in Iowa, baby. But yes, we'd have campaign rallies, we'd have events at the office. And so that was definitely kind of where things took off a little bit. And then going to Iowa for the caucuses in 2020, I believe, was definitely an eye-opening experience for me because I'd never, I'd voted before, but a caucus, for people who don't know, is kind of, if you think of the original democracy as developed in like Athens, Greece, where the men of the town get together in the forum and decide the business, it's kind of modeled on that.
Mhm.
So basically, there's a caucus day. I forget what day it was, whatever Tuesday in January, and you have your caucusing location, and you have to show up there on time in person, and you literally get together with your people. So I sent you the photo as I'm standing on the balcony, looking over, like, all right, there's the clumps of, I don't even remember, the Cory Booker people, the Pete people, the Biden people, whoever else is running. I forget at this point. So all of these different groups, and then they have to hit a certain number, and there's a guy with a megaphone yelling. So it was definitely interesting, but like, I was not a fan of the process because not everybody has that time available. Like, listen, if you say I got to be somewhere at 6:30 at night, that's great. I'm a single guy. I don't have any kids. I can do that. But if you have an elderly parent, if you work second shift, if you any of 1,000 things which prevents you from being there, you don't get to participate in the democracy.
Mhm.
And so that kind of really it irked me because there's a lot of people that just can't participate. And so why should those people not be able to caucus just because they have, a life? So that kind of bugged me. And we can go on about the caucus system, like Iowa's 95.3% white, which is the joke. Because, yeah, the first caucus is in Iowa, which is 95% white, as opposed to the bastion of diversity, which is New Hampshire, which is only 93% white. So I'm like, why do we give a bunch of Iowa farmers control over who's going to be the president? I mean, it just makes me angry. Give us like 4 states. Because, yeah, like, I forget how far out we started calling Iowa, but like months in advance. And so by the 3 days before the caucuses, nobody's picking up the phone.
Yeah.
It's just ringing and ringing. And so I'm like, yeah, no, any of these polls that come out, it's just like, whoever you call, they don't know who you are. They don't know what you want. They're just giving you numbers.
Mhm.
But yeah, so we went out for the caucus, and I was campaigning door to door. That's, talk about all the interviews I did, but I started campaigning door to door. A bunch of the local South Bend news organizations came out. So I think it was ABC 57. I remember it was Tiffany Solomay, her and her camera person came out. They followed me and my friend as we're knocking on doors and putting up the flyers and all of that. So that was a lot of fun. I ended up on the front page of the South Bend Tribune because I did an interview. I have that framed somewhere. And because I'm
Nice.
kind of affable and I like to talk, as you can see. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I thought about it. I think I did like 16 interviews. Like, I was on
Oh, wow.
the second most popular network in South Korea. It's like MBC or something. So yeah, no, anybody is like, oh, you need an interview? Go get Josh. He'll do the interview. And I
Oh,
actually
wow.
appeared very, very briefly on CNN because Jake
Uh-huh.
Tapper was at our caucusing location, and I'm wearing the blue South Bend for Pete shirt, and I'm just standing there. I'm like, I don't watch CNN, not because of anything. I hate watching the news. So I'm like, oh, here's a guy with a camera, and he's like, no, you're a Pete supporter. We don't want you. We're going to go find somebody else. And so all of a sudden, my phone blows up. Everybody's like, I saw you on CNN. I'm like, that's pretty cool. So yeah,
So,
lots of media interviews, lots of print interviews. So yeah, after the caucusing, we went to the rally, and so as people remember, that caucus was, I don't know what the right term was, but it was unclear who won. And so when Pete got up to give his speech, things were still up in the air. There hadn't been a declared winner. And so, it kind of took a little bit of the air out of the room because if Pete had gotten a decisive victory in Iowa, that would have carried on into New Hampshire. So officially, according to the Democratic Party in Iowa, he won. But the Bernie Sanders people complain. It doesn't matter. He still came in top 2 in his first 2 primaries ever running for national office, which is a significant achievement for anybody. But yeah, so
Right.
that was a little bit rough. We were all kind of upset, but just watching the conspiracy theories, like, the guy flipping the coin and, oh, he moved his hand this way and that. I'm like, listen, if the Pete campaign could know in advance which out of the 2,800 caucusing spots was going to be a tie, and he knew the person who was running it and the tie breaking method, and he was able to get to that person in advance to have him flip the coin the right way to have Pete win that caucus, I'm like, I want that guy for president. He gets it done.
Yeah, he got quite a bit of slack for declaring victory early before the results were announced, didn't he?
Just, yeah. I'm trying not to trash the Bernie Sanders supporters, but my God, the Rose Twitter people were so angry. Because as I said, I ran the Pete subreddit, and I've been eternally online since like the late 90s. So unfortunately, I've encountered every form of trolling ever. And like, I remember somebody made a video post, and I didn't really listen to it. I just clicked it. I'm like, oh, it's a Pete speech. I don't see why this was reported. And then I turned the sound on, and somebody had taken a Pete speech and replaced all of the words with rat squeaks.
Mhm.
And I was, I'm two heads. I'm like, all right, I'm going to ban this person because they're a jerk. But on the other side, I'm like, it's kind of funny. But yeah, we got a lot of flack. And it was just the part that drove me up the wall the most, and all of my lefties will immediately relate to this, is that it wasn't the attacks from the other side. It was our own people that were coming after us, like Andrew Yang, the Yang Gang. They were perpetually online, perpetually trouble. The Bernie Sanders people, the Rose Twitter people, perpetually uh, a nuisance. And it was frustrating for me because I voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016. Like, I'm far left of the Democratic Party these days, but even when I wasn't, I will still vote for any Democrat that was nominated. And so if Bernie Sanders had won, I'd have not voted for him. If uh, I can't remember, if Andrew Yang won, I probably wouldn't vote for him. Yeah, but like, just the lack of unity. It's like, let the best person win. There's no need to destroy us. And that, as a South Bend resident, watching the national news media come in and start reporting on things that I was intimately familiar with, I was like, you get that kind of vision into what the media narrative will do. Because they started interviewing people that, calling Pete a racist and all of these things that were not true. And, the bulldozing the houses was only in poor areas. I'm like, yes, that's where abandoned houses generally are. It wasn't a racial thing. It was that these houses needed to come down. And so, it hurt my pride a little bit. So that's why I always made sure to kind of avoid those topics whenever I spoke to the national and international news media. I hadn't said that in a while. I forgot about that. I appeared in a book, actually. I'm
Oh.
trying to remember his name. He's going to get real upset. We'll have to do like the post production. Like, here's a link to the book, but one of the other Pete team members wrote a book about the campaign, and I think
Hmm.
he said I was in it. And then I hadn't actually watched the Netflix documentary on the campaign, which I know probably should get around to doing that, but I'm pretty sure I'm in there. And
Oh.
it's been 4 years, and here I am still doing a podcast and talking about it. So it's definitely like a big part of my life because as the campaign was going, I was running, as part of the digital captain team. So I was running 6 different Twitter accounts, which was hilarious because I was running the Reddit for Pete account, I was running the South Bend for Pete account, and like 3 or 4 others. And so people would add me into the group chats, multiple accounts. I'm like, nope, still me. Oh yeah, to the other account, nope, still me. People are like, what? How are you everybody? Yeah, but I was in like different Slacks and Discords. Like, it got to the point where I'm just like, I'm done. I got to step out a little bit because the Biden campaign tapped me also. So I was technically a digital captain for the Biden campaign, but I
Mhm.
didn't really do a whole lot with them. They also tried to tap me for the midterms, and I'm just like, I'm good. That was fun, but like, I'm trying. But I live in Texas, and so it's an uphill battle. But I still fought.
So, can I ask you what subreddit is? Because I'm not very familiar with social media.
Right. So basically, Reddit is a website, and there are different kind of subsections of that website organized by whatever. So if you like whiskey, there's a whiskey subreddit. If you like, you know, planting trees, there's a tree subreddit. And
Mm,
so it's basically just kind of a just another social media page. It was basically the evolution of Dig. I don't know if you remember that.
no.
That's okay. Yeah, it's basically just an online forum. And so the Pete
Mm,
subreddit we had, I forget what we got up to at the end, but a couple million views a month, which was amazing.
mm. So, did Pete's campaign actually hire you as part of their staff, or did you do most of this voluntarily?
It was all volunteer work. I was never an employee
Oh,
of the campaign. Uh,
okay.
and that was one of the criticisms. I hate to take a swing at the guy, but a lot of the South Bend locals that wanted to work on the campaign were not hired. Instead, out of town people were brought in. And so a lot of people are kind of chafing against that. It's like, we're South Bend locals. We want to come work for you. Why are you bringing in college students from California? So that was a little bit of, people were a little bit upset about that. But, again, first campaign, not a lot of resources. You do what you can. You hire
Hmm.
young people who will work for pinball tokens instead of, us South Bend locals. But yeah, no, oh man, I was working two jobs and going to school full time, so I was busy.
Oh, wow. It's a lot to take on. So, I mean, obviously you were inspired by Pete to just be able to do all this volunteering stuff for him. Was that how you kind of felt? Like you were inspired, you wanted this guy to be president no matter what, and did the best you can to get him there?
Yeah, I mean, there's also a little bit of like proximity and civic pride. I know Pete. I've known him for years. He's a solid guy. I know his husband Chaston. We've gotten drinks together. Like
Hmm.
I know him. He's a good guy. And then also his experience. Like fine, he doesn't have 50 years in the Senate, but I would much rather take somebody who was born after the advent of color television or sliced bread or any of those things as we look at the 2024 election between a 79-year-old and an 81-year-old. I would much rather have somebody closer to my generation. I remember when they called Obama the first digital president because he had a Blackberry in like 2000, what was that, 12? I'm like, oh, come on, people. Blackberry, really? That's what it takes to be a digital president? But yeah, so I liked his policies, obviously. He's military experience. People like to get upset at him for that. But, he did a 6 month tour in Afghanistan, which is more than I've done. I wouldn't go to Afghanistan. Are you kidding me? He's very well educated. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He speaks multiple languages. He's very, the LGBT aspect is important. I don't think somebody should be defined by their sexuality, but as we as a society fight with these issues. I thought these issues were settled, and then here we go marching backwards. The overturning of Roe versus Wade, all of these bathroom bills. Like, you know, you can take a look at me, and I'm like, I'm not a member of the LGBT community, but I hang out with those people, and so to watch good friends of mine quite literally flee the country, move out of the United States, out of Texas, because they're afraid for themselves, they're afraid for their children. Like, if we had a president who wasn't, we might be able to do a little bit better as a society in being progressive.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like everything is going backwards. Just exactly what you said about LGBTQ rights, Roe versus Wade, women's choice. I mean, do you think that Pete would have a chance in this kind of environment now that he's had more, national exposure as Secretary of DOT?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I literally could not name a single secretary of the Department of Transportation ever. And so, now that Pete's getting attention, and these secretary positions aren't the highest profile, but it definitely takes a lot of wind out of the sails of people that said, Pete doesn't have any national experience. I'm like, no, he's a Biden cabinet member now. No, so he's got that. So I think that will definitely help him in the future because I see him making a run again. I don't know when. Maybe next election in 2020. Oh my God, 2028. Living in the future is weird. So we'll see if he runs then or maybe not down in the future, but I don't think Secretary of the Department of Transportation is the end. And he's still, we're doing a podcast about Pete 4 years after he dropped out of the primary. So he still has support. He still has people doing podcasts, doing events, keeping his name out there. So I don't think he's done. He's still a young guy. I actually don't remember how old he is, but he's not too much older than me. So yeah, I would definitely like to see him run for president again. And, it'll be all right, I'll come out of retirement for one last job kind of a thing. But I'm not going back to Iowa in January. It was cold. Oh my God.
Yeah, it is pretty cold, and I've heard a lot of stories about people trying to make it through the snow and ice and all that. So you guys are really warriors, I would say, for being out
Yeah.
there knocking on doors.
Yeah, I mean it wasn't too bad. We saw the Pete Mobile was there, which was hilarious. It was like an ice cream truck that they put a wrap on and were selling Pete merchandise out of. So
Hmm.
that was kind of funny because I know I was a little bit distracted this morning. I would have found my South Bend for Pete shirt because I sent you a picture. I still have a drawer of all of his 2020 stuff. I got the stickers, I got the lanyards, I got the koozies, I got the buttons. Like I got all that stuff. I'm waiting for it. We'll be ready.
Yeah, definitely. It will be exciting when he runs again. So going back to being a South Bender and having lived there, I know there's a lot of stories about Pete in the national news that were kind of, like you said, a little maybe inflated, or they said things that were inaccurate. Um, so being a mayor of a city of 100,000 people, they said, well, that's too small of a city. I mean, how do you translate that into the national stage? But I feel like being a mayor is, like being president. You're actually, um, oh gosh, what's the term I'm looking for? You're not legislating, you're not passing laws, you're governing, right? And so
Right.
his experience as a mayor and governing a city, even though it's a small size, but the job duties are kind of the same, right?
Yeah, it's just a matter of scale. So I don't think that,
Hmm.
the criticism that he's a small town mayor, South Bend is the fourth largest city in Indiana, but I don't think that criticism holds as much weight as people would like it to, because it's more about management than anything else. It's not like Pete has to figure out the budget for the United States. He's got a Department of Treasury. It's not like Pete has to figure out transportation. There's a Secretary of Transportation. So it's just more, shall we say, captaining the ship than it is having a tremendous amount of specific knowledge about all of these things. Because if you take a look at, a senator, they are one of 100 people who work in a chamber to make decisions. And, state senators are the same way. So mm, it just bugged me, but that's fine. Like, people will do what they're going to do. And so, I was pretty aware Pete didn't have the best chances because it was his first time running for national office. And that was always the fun part is people are struggling how to pronounce his name because that's
Hmm.
always the joke. Like the person with the easier to pronounce last name wins. So I know that was a big up for the people of Malta about seeing their name in the news. But yeah, I don't think the criticism about the experience, because again, very well educated, has been in the military, has served his city well. I think those sorts of things would translate well to national office. And also, he would not have a lot of the entrenched history because we take a look at our President Biden, who worked on passing the Crime Reform Act, which made crack cocaine sentences 100 times longer than cocaine sentences. because racism and, all of the other things in Biden's past, like, yeah, I'll vote for him, but he's got this history. And so Pete not having that kind of baggage, I think, would be more helpful than anything else. And also, again, just the progressive aspect, because as I mentioned, our current president, we haven't made a lot of progress in a lot of things that we could do relatively easily. Tried the student loan thing, that didn't work. There are ways around that. Marijuana legalization would be great. Criminal reform would be great. All of these policies that could be done if there was the will from the top to do it, but I just don't think there is. So you need somebody who has not been beaten down by the political machine for 30 years or has 30 years of horse trading. Well, I owe this person a favor because they voted for this bill 15 years ago and these constituents. So having somebody with less baggage, I think, would be helpful. And also, as I said, youth. It's not to be ageist or anything like that. It's just if I ran for a job at 81 years old, they would laugh at me. And now we're asking somebody to run the free world when he should be running the canasta game in a retirement home. But this is all we got. And so I'm just kind of like, that's me taking a swing at the Democratic Party. Like, come on now. There's got to be, give me somebody, anybody else next time in 2024.
Yeah, and I think I share the same sentiment with you in terms of that age issue because I mean there are a lot of other candidates possibly in the Democratic Party who can be a better choice, and I mean I don't have any issues with what Biden has accomplished so far, and he did say he wants to be a transitional president, so why not leave on a high note, with what you've accomplished already and hand it over to the next generation.
Yeah, it would be absolutely wonderful to have another Democratic president after Biden because it's just this weird thing where it just flops back and forth.
Hmm.
So hopefully, yeah, and especially if he's not going to run for re-election again, he can then throw some things in that might not be the most popular, but will definitely help us. But yeah, no, I liked Pete's policies. Data driven is very important because we have people that like to make decisions more out of, emotion and feeling than actual data about what the problem is. Because, talked about the sewers in South Bend, the smartest sewer system in the country, which I thought was funny. But, as somebody who collects data professionally, it's important. Like, you might feel that X, Y, and Z is the correct answer, but if you have guidance, and that's kind of one of the things as I had researched more about politics, we used to have a congressional science office in addition to the congressional budget office. But that was shut down by the Republicans. I forget what year that was. And so, it would be nice to have scientific advisory for our people as we stare down the barrel of catastrophic climate change. So, yeah, just having somebody who cares about getting the correct data and making decisions based on that data as opposed to how they feel about something would be just excellent, I feel.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I loved about Pete was he's such a visionary thinker that his policies are kind of, decades long impact
Yeah,
if he's able to implement them. And I just feel like most of the politicians today are so short-sighted, and especially with the whole climate thing that you're talking about. His climate core um, policy could go a long way if he's able to implement that. Um,
yeah, that was a big part. Transportation was a big part of the Green New Deal. Like we talk about
mhm.
electric cars, but the answer is not electrified vehicles, it's just less vehicles. So light
Right.
rail, commuter rail, buses, those sorts of things are a much better solution than
Mhm.
electric vehicles. And hey, maybe the guy who runs a transportation party can work on the funding. Excuse me. So yeah, that was one of the things that I liked was the long-term thinking. Then also the short-term thinking, because he mentioned like sunset policies on military actions. Because that was one of the things, as somebody who grew up during both of the Middle Eastern wars we waged, rather unsuccessfully, you just, after a decade and a half of watching people bang their heads against the wall, it's like, well, maybe we should have a pause and rethink if we should continue to do this. So Pete's idea of having like a sunset, after 5 years, you know, we pause and we I forget what the words were, but basically pause and then see if we want to reauthorize these actions. So that would be very helpful because we have a lot of things, legislation is very momentum driven. So once the legislation is in there, it's very difficult to get rid of it. I filed my taxes this year and I was like, boy, howdy, it would be nice to take the home office deduction, but I was knocked out in 2017 and it won't be back in until 2025. It was kind of annoying. And so having like, all right, let's take a look at these things because we had the Affordable Care Act, which was amazing. I used it. And it would be great if, like, all right, let's go back in a few years and start expanding it. Let's put in a public option. Let's put in more things, but we just kind of put these policies into place and we just stick with them, which isn't necessarily the most efficient thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the policies that I liked about his was the Medicare for all who want it. And so basically, that's giving people who already have good health insurance the option to, stick with that or go to a public plan that he was going to implement. And so I feel like that's giving people a choice rather than forcing them into something that they may not want. Um, and there's a lot of other policies of his that are just amazing if only they can be implemented. But like you say, it's hard when you have a Congress that, every 4 years there's change and then you can't really get a whole lot done, even if you're president.
Yeah, it's definitely, we could talk about structural issues in the US system, but this first past the post voting strategy where whoever gets to 51%, you've basically just created the two-party system. So if we did something radical like switching to ranked choice voting, you would not only break that sort of deadlock where it's literally like, it was one guy that held up the student loan forgiveness, which is somebody who has student loans still, would be nice. And, we had the military appointments held up because when you're dealing with, 100 people and it's 49 to 51 or it's 50-50 and there's an independent, so much responsibility falls down to these very tiny wedge issues where if you were able to have if you were able to have ranked choice voting and more than two political parties became viable, you would then have a lot easier time working with legislation because it's like, all right, I'm kind of here, these people are kind of there, so we'll grab these people for this vote, we'll grab these people for this vote. I personally think it would help the system immensely.
Yeah, and it seems like when they were trying to get the infrastructure bills passed, and I think I remember reading an article about one of the Republican either senators or Congress people who said that they really enjoyed working with Pete in the negotiations because he's very I guess democratic, diplomatic, and so he'll try to meet you where you are rather than shoving something down your throat and a lot of times, people think, oh, it's my way or the highway, whereas his thinking is more of, all right, can we come to an agreement? And I feel like as a commander in chief or someone like him in the Oval Office, things can certainly get done more because he is so, he's a good negotiator.
Yeah, that's very important because it's not. Man, I had a good thought and I completely forgot about it.
See, you did that to me earlier.
So yeah, having a commander in chief that's willing to work through the issue, that's what I was going to talk about, right? So you get a lot of people that try to like purity test it and they want all or nothing. And so again, I have shifted further and further left. So you get into these spaces where people are like, incremental change isn't what we need. We need a revolution. We need to take down the system and destroy it. And it's difficult for me because I consider myself a pragmatist. So, like, I like to, there's lots of things I would like to see. We talked about that. Universal health care, education, all of these things. I would like to see that. But then I also see the world for how it is. And it is unlikely that we will see a titanic shift in our political landscape outside of something catastrophic happening. And so within the current system, you have to work for incremental change. And we have had some success doing that. And so I think Pete would be excellent for that because he can kind of pull people over. Because as you said, if you have one person on one side screaming, yelling, you have to do this, and the other person screaming, they have to do this, and they're just yelling at each other, it doesn't accomplish anything. And so if we have people who are willing to, work the angles a little bit. But unfortunately, in our current political society, the left has kind of stayed here, and as the right moves over, it kind of pulls the left over. So our Democratic Party is more centrist than it is anything else, just because the right has shifted so far over, which is absolutely frightening for the next election. I don't necessarily want to touch on that all that much, but for the love of God, people, please register to vote. It does matter, even if you live in a red state. Like having lived in Indiana and having lived in, currently living in Texas, it's tough being a Democratic voter. Like Indiana, every year since 1964 went red, except for when they went blue for Obama in 2000. When did he run the first time? 2008. And then they immediately went back to voting red. So, like, they tried. They did. They tried. And so, I know we say this every year, but every election is important. But this one's going to be bad.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that the American people will make the right decision, but you just never know. That's why I feel like Pete is such a perfect um, choice because he is so. People say he's very liberal, but I think he's actually quite moderate in terms um, of how he approaches things. Like you said, you're pragmatic. I feel like I'm very pragmatic too. And so change is incremental. You can't expect it overnight. And so it can't be an all or nothing. You got to do one thing at a time. And I feel like one of the interviews that Pete gave, he gave a very good description of this and how, in terms of how he can pull people to his side. And that is to get them to go incrementally. And then once you accomplish that, then you kind of go the next step. And then you try to achieve the next part of what your plan is. And so that I think is very, very, um, it's a good approach rather than what's happening right now.
Yeah, and that was one of the things when Pete was mayor, when the outside people came in and said, look at this city, the poverty rate, all of the issues the city has. There was there's a police tape scandal.
Right.
Pete ended up letting the police chief go, and there was cries about racism for that. And it's just like, again, he is a mayor, not a dictator. He doesn't decide all of these things. The schools in South Bend are very bad, but that's not the mayor's responsibility. That's more of a state level thing. And so within the power that he had as mayor, he did work to make the city better. And there were significant improvements, but you can't reverse, a 40-year population decline overnight. You can't reverse the horrific damage that the first financial crisis in 2008 did to the city with the destruction of the real estate market. You can't overcome all of these things just by waving a magic wand. So he put the work in. He was there, he led the city, he was part of the civic organizations, and he made the city better, and he gave people, I hate to say it, gave people hope. Because people could look to him and go, okay, this guy is trying, he's doing what he can do. I don't remember who the mayor was before Pete. I didn't see the guy. I don't know who he was, but I saw Pete. And yeah, people might say, you don't have to be a man of the streets to be a good legislator, but it's definitely a bonus, at least in my book, that he is just a human being and likes to hang out with other human beings and do human things. Because we see all of these politicians that like they haven't stepped out of their bubble in so long. They want to keep the filthy, unwashed masses to the side, and that's not who Pete is, and that's not who Pete was when he was in South Bend. Like everybody knew him.
And one of the things that you mentioned, hope, is kind of what his campaign gave me back then when I had no hope of what the future was going to hold. But yeah, as soon as I first heard him speak, I just felt, wow, this guy is very refreshing, and I feel hopeful, and I think that's what inspired me to get involved in his campaign. And I think everybody who was involved with his campaign would say the same thing, that he inspired them. And right now, looking at our political, uh, yeah, it's not inspiring.
No. Yeah, like a lot of people read, Pete's book, which I also read. I don't know if I had him sign it or not. But yeah, it was, very inspirational because I remember, I hate to bring him up, but I read Rudy Giuliani's book about how he tackled the issues in New York City. That was long before, he took a little bit of a dive off of sanity.
Mhm.
And so, there was a lot of similarities. Like, no, I need data. I need everybody in the room. You can't just say, oh, I'm waiting for the information. Oh, I need to talk to this person. It's like, no, everybody in the room, I'm going to hold you accountable. So that's part of the thing that Pete was about. It was about getting the information, making sure people were accountable, getting the job done. As he says, all politics is local. So if your water doesn't work, you're not going to be happy. You're going to call your representative and make a stink about it. And so we as a country have a lot of things that don't work. And so we call our representatives and yell at them about it. And so that's why I think Pete would be an excellent commander in chief, because that scales. So fine, my water not working is a personal local issue that I can handle. But oh, I don't know, let's say Flint, Michigan having water, lead in the water, that's the same issue just on a larger scale. And so the solutions also scale the same way. It's like, all right, my water doesn't work, let's fix that. And then you can just kind of expand that. So it's a matter of philosophy more than it is a technical matter of scale. Like how you deal with these small issues is the same way you deal with the big issues.
And from Pete, I learned how important local politics is, and that's why on the ballot, a lot of people just vote for whoever's president, but they don't really care so much as who's their senator or who's their mayor. And that is really, really important because politics affects us every day, even if we don't realize it, and especially on the local level. So I think from Pete, I learned the importance of local politics and state politics. So it's not just the presidency that matters.
Yeah, I mean, in recent news, Michigan was the first state in a very long time to overturn right to work legislation. For those who aren't familiar, it's a union thing. So basically, previous to right to work legislation, in order to work at a business, you had to be a member of the union. So what right to work legislation did is it removed that. So people can work at a shop and not be a member of the union, but still benefit from collective bargaining agreements and this, that, and the other thing. And also the unions could, have some influence over the employers. So Michigan turning that back to now where unions will become more powerful. And we have seen recently with the uptick in youth union membership, all the Starbucks unionizing, that's local. But those local politics of like, all right, my job sucks because I'm not making enough money and my boss is a jerk. How do we fix that? Those issues, as I said, same thing with the water, it scales the same way. So I'm going to unionize my coffee shop. I'm going to unionize the other coffee shops. And so as you scale that up, now you have a labor market where we have more active unions. You have more companies that are accountable to their employees. and the CEOs aren't getting $300 million bonuses while a chunk of their workforce is using government benefits. Sorry, I went on
Yeah.
a rant there. Yeah, so as we talked about, I was like, what? All right, yeah, so politics being local. Well, yeah, those same local issues affect you on a small scale or on a national scale. So
Yeah.
that's why I think Pete would be an excellent person because he knows what those local issues are. He knows how to handle those sorts of issues. And so if it's just a matter of scale, he would definitely have what he needs or the ability to find it out.
Yeah, right? Because I feel like all this stuff about his inexperience, it's like I feel like he has the most experience because even if you're just a senator, all you're doing is passing laws
Yeah,
and you're not seeing things on the local level every day, the way that things affect people. And so, I don't know, I just think that he has a better perspective. Um,
absolutely. Yeah, I would take Pete. I forget what is it a history degree? I feel bad I didn't look that up. I would take Pete and insert degree here over, a lawyer senator who has never, sat down with a constituent and talked about, whatever issues that they're discussing. Because, the
yeah.
story about Pete going to the hospital and translating Arabic for the people that couldn't talk. Like, I don't know any senators who would do that. They wouldn't even be available. You call your senator at 11 o'clock at night, you're getting voicemail, but you call Pete at 11 o'clock at night, he's picking up the phone, he's getting in the car, he's driving over, and he's helping. And yes, the president of the United States can't drive around the country and do that, but that same connection to the people is, I think, the most important thing because, like, people with long political careers, they get more and more disconnected from the things. I remember it was Hillary Clinton didn't have a driver's license, and as somebody who lives in a car heavy existence, it blew my mind. But I'm like, no, you get driven everywhere. And so, he drives a car. And it seems like such a minor thing, but that kind of gives you a perspective on the lack of perspective a lot of people who have long term national political careers have.
He is so personable. Even when you meet him on the campaign trail, right? A lot of people have said the same thing, is that how personable he is and what a good listener he is. So,
And he's a good hang. Like some of the pictures I sent you know, Dingus Day is this really weird random Polish holiday that's celebrated in like two cities in the country. But Pete did the thing, got up, held the crowd, gave amazing speeches. We all saw his. I remember his first appearance on CNN. I was the only person in the bar. I was like, "Hey, can you turn on CNN? The mayor's going to be on." People are like, "What?" And then we're having these absolutely massive rallies for all of the debates and Pete, I'm not a fisherman, but I know bait when I see it. He's just knocking it out of the park and just destroying people. Like that's what I want. I don't want somebody who is not going to fight for what the people need. I want somebody who's going to have our back as his constituents. And Pete, as a mayor, as a Department of Transportation secretary, as hopefully the president of the United States one day, I know that he's got my back.
well said. Well said.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I think that we are close to our time here, so I'm gonna let you get back to doing what you're doing for the day and finishing
Make
your
me a
job.
sandwich and go back to saving the world.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you, Josh. Really appreciate your time and all your good stories there.
Not a problem, Kim. I appreciate the opportunity. And if you ever want me back on your podcast, let me know.
Sure thing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Right.